So we are happy and to have with us today Jona Laak, Dr. Jona Laak, who is an economist in the University of Applied Science in Munich and research director at the consultation PR.com, studying political science and economics, studied political science economics at LMU, and the floor is yours. We're happy to have you.
Thank you. First of all, I have to say, of course, it's an honor to speak after the conditions here in the center, and I'm very happy for the support you gave me in coming here and presenting you my ideas. It's, you might see, work in progress, so it's the idea to build a project out of this, and I'm very happy to have found in the last 4 weeks since I'm here the time to bring this on a status quo so that it is presentable for you. The idea is to connect to fields of research I've worked on within the last now 10 years since my PhD. And so on the one hand, the theory of the state of exception, on the other hand, the economics of innovation, which is my main research interest within the last 5 years. So I will try with this talk to develop a conceptual framework, a theoretical framework, which I want to use for my analysis. And I'm, of course, glad for your input on this. And yeah, it is the basic for the data work I want to include in the following approach. So now it works. Well, why do I think that it makes sense to work on this topic, and especially on the topic of innovation and economic resilience? And I'll explain later why I choose these two terms. What we see in Western democracies, and you all know this, is an increase of the number and also the intensity of exceptional policies, state of exception, state of emergencies. And there are also a lot of cases which we will see in my eyes in the next years that will become more and more virulent. So if we look into the results of climate change and the effects it will cause on political systems, on geopolitical questions, on also economic questions, I guess that's huge. And also something like the pandemic, and I will use it often as a reference point within my research, is not a singular effect. So it's quite likely that something like this will appear again, and the question is what we will learn from it. And also you see the other example. I still remember during my studies Fukuyama's work and the idea of an end of conflict with a world of democracies. I guess we can all see that this is a dream which is currently a bit under construction or under fire, however you want to call it. And I think these are cases that show us that the number of exceptional situations we will see in the next decade will, in my eyes, increase. And it has already increased. I will show this with some of my previous data I had. So my personal research project here is focusing on, as I call it, the tertiary effect. So that's the idea from the economic theory to say we have externalities. That means effects on third parties which are not directly influenced in their development. And I think this is the focus I want to set with my research, to really look on the effects in other subsystems than the rule of law area, and which are influenced or caused by exceptional policies. And this is the aim I want to deal with my research. The question is, how do exceptional policies influence innovation and economic resilience? Some previous data. I'm currently building up a data set, and the idea with this theoretical construction I'm presenting today is to really define the parameters I want to compare. And the data I'm currently having, it's 280 cases, which I have collected within the last 1.5 years. And what I could already see, and this is just it's without numbers because it's not finished yet, but what you can see really is that the last 25 to 30 years have led to a growth in the use of state of exceptions and state of emergencies. And it's not just the pandemic as a peak point. It's really becoming more and more part of the policy making in several democracies. And from my perspective, this is what I call a culture of exceptional policies. So some of the states really use this kind of policy making more and more for different scenarios. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about natural catastrophes or diseases or riots or whatever. So there are a number of trigger momentum. But if you look, it's of course a bit small, but in Israel, in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, India, France, Poland, US, and also Canada, these are some political systems that really tend to use exceptional policies more and more within the last years. So that's an interesting observation in my eyes. And it's also part of my idea of this research process, because I think that it is defining a certain culture in political decision making, that you tend to use this kind of rule of law in extreme conditions to define and shape your policy making. So I'm using the term of exceptional policies a lot. It's just the idea to sum these different legal concepts we have in different constitutions up. I simply ask myself, what is the really important aspect that differs exceptional policies from other forms of policy making? And I think it's, on the one hand, the fact that the exceptional policy has to be connected in any form to the constitution. I mean, it starts with Schmidt's development, but it's going up to today's theoretical concept that you say the legal order in a state of exception still has to be connected to the constitutional order. Otherwise, it's simply no longer part of the constitutional order. I think there has to be a certain aim. So exceptional policies always have the aim to tackle a certain or solve a certain situation. And of course, you have to create some results with this kind of policy. So as we see it in Israel, the question, how does it change the rule of law? How sovereignty designed? Are there any shifts in political power? How do they appear? So I think these are the main results of a exceptional policy. And this is why I define it in my research simply as a policy in order to handle a exceptional situation. And this kind of policy is characterized by the restriction of basic rights in favor of executive power. So this is the definition I'm working with, and that makes it possible to include different forms of exceptional policies that we see worldwide. For example, if we look into the pandemic in Germany, we didn't use the official state of exception, which we have in the constitution. It was simply an additional law which was made, but had the same consequences, but it was a different legal framework. And I want to include all these kind of frameworks in my analysis. So I don't want to go into detail here, but in order to show you, I address with my research the state-of-the-art research on the empirical analysis of state of exceptions, and I work on the economic effects. So if you look what is currently, what has been researched with regard to the economic effects of state of exceptions, then it's a very special focus. So the main interest focus is with regard to a certain situation in economics as a starting point for exceptional policies. So, for example, you have a financial crisis or a severe financial crisis, and you need to use a state of exception to realize a certain policy making. And so it's always the starting point for the emergency policy. And one of the most researched examples is the Troika measures within the Euro crisis. So there we have a clear economic starting point with the crisis of the Euro in Greece, and then the implementation of a exceptional committee, the Troika, and of course you can analyze the consequences of this. And the other part I'm using to evaluate the output on innovation, there I'm addressing the macroeconomic economics of innovation. And of course, there are several studies that build up theories and models on this topic. So let me jump into the question why I'm talking now from innovation and economic resilience. I want to explain this to you. If we look into the theory of innovation, then we had in the microeconomic perspective, in the theory, for a long time, two very opposite models. And then we found in the end of the 1970s, 80s, the institutional economics was founded, and it was, so to say, a third approach to innovation. And before we had two different models, we were, to say it easy, rely on either the supply side or the demand side as the driving factor for innovation. And what I present you here is simply the one side. It's a innovation model that sees the consumer, the customer, as the one who drives innovation. So he demands a new product, a new process, and because of this demand, corporates tend to develop something new, something disruptive, and in the end, this process leads to the implementation of a new disruptive innovation. And you can see here, it's a quite simple model. It just sees innovation as in the form of a new technology that makes the output higher if you have a certain input. So this is just a so-called production function we use a lot in microeconomics, and it explains the input-output relation. You can see here, with innovation, you get higher output for used input factor. And this is a so-called demand-side model of innovation. And the other one is much more important and something much more well-known. It's the Schumpeter model, and he sees this from the other side. So he sees really the entrepreneur, the supply side, as the side who pushes innovation into economy. And with Schumpeter, it starts, in my eyes, and this is the way I read him, innovation model that really accepts that innovation is not just a technology that appears in markets. It's based in a social system. It's based in the question how people work together and how a firm or an entrepreneur itself is embedded in a certain environment. So he creates an innovation term that is much more detailed and that is much more connected. And I think it is a model that, and this is the reason why it's still used today, creates a higher value to research if you try to think it is interdisciplinary, because what he sees is, in my eyes, something that we can also really transport into the political arena. So innovation for him is to tackle an unexperienced area, you see this here, and to handle with social resistance, to take society to deal with this unpredictable situation. And if you think about a state of exception, in my eyes, it's exactly the same. So you have to take people to accept a certain unexpected situation, and you have to overcome social resistance to handle this new situation. So it's, in my eyes, the same cultural thinking that you find in innovation in this process as a form of economic resilience, and that you find on a state of exception in form of bringing people to handle a certain risky situation. And the other aspect, and you will find this later in my theoretical assumptions, is the fact that for him, innovation is always a risk parameter. So he defines this very clearly, that thinking innovative means taking risks. And taking risks is, of course, also something that we find in a state of exception. So it's the measurement of risks. It's also balancing risks and the question how stringent you try to rule something or how much risk you accept. So I think these are similar terms and a similar culture, and this is something I'm trying to use as a connection in my research. Okay, to sum this up, I make it briefly. Innovation is important for resilience because it is the most influencing factor to economic growth. That means if you think at the pandemic, if you're able to develop a new vaccine, you can overcome an economic crisis much easier. And in the end, you reach a higher economic output, and this much quicker than before. So this is the causal chain I'm thinking about, and why I'm talking about innovation and resilience. On the other hand, and you may also know this, resilience is of course also the environment that enables innovation. So it's not just the endpoint, it's also the environment that makes it possible, this kind of development. Yeah, so I just want to shortly jump into the pandemic example to discuss what I mean and why I think that this research topic has its value. I mean, what we all know is that the pandemic influenced the use of state of exceptions. The majority of democratic systems use this as kind of policy making. But if you look onto how this resulted in macroeconomic parameters, you can see that the results are very different. So there are countries who have a severe decline in their GDP and innovation indicators, and there are other countries who have a better result, and there are even countries who are opposite to the average trend. So it's not that easy that you say, okay, for example, as I said here, I tested it. It's not easy to say the fiscal spending is high, and so you have a good GDP trend, or you have a certain sector and you have a certain trend, or even the fact that you say you have a stringent lockdown and you have a certain GDP effect. They are all not showing a significance, this microdata. But what made me what I liked about playing with this data was the fact that it showed me something, that the pandemic, for example, clearly differs from other forms of economic crisis before when we look into the innovation parameters. So what I mean by this is just one example, but there are several that show a similar result. So here, for example, in 2002, 2003, we had the so-called dot-com crisis. So it was a crisis of the digital business model. And what you might expect, crisis of a new digital model that might result into a decline of entrepreneurial activity, but it was not the case. In 2009, we had one of the severest crises in the economy with financial crisis. And if you look into the data here, you can see that the decline is not very strong. There is a small decline in most of the countries, but not very strong. And if you look now into the pandemic, which had a similar effect just from the output perspective, you can see that the decline in the average countries is around 2 to 3 times stronger on innovation parameters than compared to the other economic crises. So this is something special about the pandemic, if we regard it from the innovation perspective. And I ask myself, where is this coming from? And my personal answer, and I want to prove it, is that this is coming from exceptional policies and the way how they influence cultural habitat. For this reason, I just want to shortly jump into 3 cultural, institutional, and communication ideas, which I work on in different projects, and show you why I think that they all show an interesting connection between these research fields and the question, how do exceptional policies influence innovation? So let me jump into institutional economics. I mean, as you all know this, and here are no students, I can make it a bit more shorter. So if we're talking about institutional economics as a connection between state of exception and innovation, we can of course say institutions, if we have a change in institutions, we have a new setting of institutions, and a new setting of institutions changes behavior of economic subjects. So we create behavior changes by institutional changes. That's the linkage. And the question is, why and how does this appear from the perspective of an economic relevance? So how does this change the economic output? And here, I think we simply can ask ourselves, what does it mean to entrepreneurs if you have a significant change of basic freedoms on the market. And in Europe, for example, there appeared something that we have never seen before. The federal borders in the pandemic were, from one moment to another, a limitation factor for every entrepreneur. And for example, in one federal state, you could open your business, and the other it was closed for 2 months. And so your customers traveled over the border 10 kilometers in order to buy it.
Are you talking about Germany in particular?
Yeah.
Yes.
To buy at a certain market. And the interesting point is, why was it not possible for the European policymaker to define common rules for the European market? I mean, we have rules that set up the basic economic rights for every subject on the economic European market, but it was not possible in the pandemic. In the pandemic, everything rolled back on the lowest level possible. So, of course, if you don't have any customers any longer, or if you're not allowed to open your business, this has an economic impact. And it also results in, and I researched on this from the small and medium-sized enterprises perspective, it also results in the fact that some of these entrepreneurs felt totally lost in the government's political agenda. So the question, you have a small company, you do some investments, and in the end, those investments simply failures because you did not know anything about the political parameters in advance, made it very risky. And it has, in my eyes, led to the fact that the entrepreneurial risk has been increased by political risks due to the insecurity of the institutional agenda. Yeah, and also what we have is that it's a very severe change of the competition idea of a liberal market. So if you really go into a market and allow some sectors and some regions to do their business and others not, and you do not compensate this really equally, this is a huge change of one of the basic ideas of a free market. And for this reason, I see it, and of course this is now the short summary to not use too much time here. I see some of the hypothetical effects that might be parameters that might be relevant for this connection. First is the question, how agile are exceptional policies to changing requirements? This is one of the big critics we have, for example, in Germany on the corona politics, that there's a missing agility to readapt to new knowledge in within the run of the pandemic. The second question is, how is it about stringency and legitimation of the limitation of the rights? The third is, how high is the predictability of the means? And the fourth is, how is the compensation of risky business models? So I see these four factors as important parameters if you try to analyze exceptional policies with regard to innovation. So I want to jump to the next theoretical approach because I have already introduced it to you. It's the idea of a cultural use of innovation. And of course, on the one hand, I mentioned Schumpeter, but also if you look into institutional economics, the most basic institutions that we can use in institutional economics to explain people's behaviors are cultural norms, cultural habitats that we use. And my personal thinking about is that it's also hypothetical, I cannot prove it, but the higher the insecurity of norms of the lower level is, so the more the policy making changes, the more people rely on their cultural habitat, and they tend to fall back to these cultural norms. And this is something that my eyes explains why some national systems are more likely to handle an exceptional situation like the pandemic, and others have bigger problems in dealing with insecurity and risks. And the third argument I want to give you is this concept of the entrepreneurial state, which draws in my eyes a similar line, saying that there's an important role of politics in setting the starting point for the private sector when we are talking about taking risks and implementing a risk-taking culture. So that's a theory draws in my eyes a very similar line, and that also sees the importance and the influence of the political arena in shaping the risk-taking culture of the private sector. So where do we see this? For example, in a lot of the current monitoring activities of the entrepreneurial sector. This is just a framework, and I want to show you the data, so I shortly explain it. This is a framework that shows the influencing parameters of the entrepreneurial development in different countries, and it compares, for example, also the environment with regard to the social, cultural, and political context, because it sees every entrepreneur very, very strongly connected to this environment in his personal decisions. So every decision you make as an entrepreneur is connected to this development. And the interesting thing is that you can really see in this data year by year, that the cultural habitat that we expect, for example, from a liberal economy versus a social economy, really appears in data. Just want to show you this with comparison of the United States and Germany. And you see here, for example, the social and cultural norms in the US, they are above the average, and in Germany, they are under the average of the comparison group. So the idea of building up your own innovative product, your own startup, is much more likely in the United States. Cultural habitat, something we get used to than in other states. So, and this cultural thinking I want to include in my research in the comparison as a parameter. So I sum this up in the hypothesis that the question how risk-taking is part of the cultural norms and how it gets supported in a crisis. This is a very important parameter if you try to compare exceptional policies with regard to innovation. So this brings me to the last part. What links, in my eyes, all these areas is communication. And we have already studies on the pandemic, for example, that show that the question that people really tend to accept and deal with government decisions is very strongly based on the question is communication, addressing them correctly and convinces them or not. And if we look into the theory of the state of exception, there is also a communication theory on this, and it sees mainly two important motifs for the communication of exceptional policies. The one is to justify what you're doing, why you're choosing an exceptional policy and how you design it. And the second is the motivation to take people to accept your policies and to work with them. And this is the second important part. And then I just don't want to go into detail, but for example, Matthias Lemke developed in his postdoc research narratives that are used in this state of exception in order to fulfill justice and motivate people for the exceptional policy. And the interesting thing is that also, if you look now into the models of the innovation process, you will find communication as a key criteria. On the one hand, in order to base the innovation process in the environment. So you can see this here, an entrepreneur that does not get validated information or is not based qualitatively in the environment, he cannot start and fulfill his communication and innovation process. And also, if you look into the internal process of the entrepreneur, you will find in the models the same. So also the idea or the line from thinking innovative to really having an innovative product on the market. So this development process itself requires the communication. And this leads me to the building of some hypotheses. So I think that the addressing of individuals and also the question of how these individuals are part of the social group or part of the economic group where they have to identify with is or are two important parameters. And the third is how are risks regarded in communication. So is risk something that gets communicated in a good way, or is it something that has a bad value? Yeah, and to sum up all these hypotheses of different theoretical perspectives, I developed a model, and you can see it here on the right side, and these are the parameters which, from a status quo, I want to structure my data set within the next months. And so I see, you see on the top, the question of a risk culture and risk compensation as an important parameter with regard to the fact, how I explained it, that the culture of risks is in the private sector is influenced by the political arena. Then here on the right side, the predictability and legitimation of exceptional policies. I guess predictability is clear. An entrepreneur who doesn't really know what's coming up and who cannot rely on certain basic rights, basic assumptions of the common market, makes wrong economic decisions. And this is, of course, something that makes innovation to a even higher risk and to something that you don't tend to do. The third vector, individuals and social group. I think this is something very important. It's at least a communication effort you have to make to show people that accepting a limitation of rights for a certain time is something that helps the whole group. So it's a question of the narratives you use, and it's crucial to the question: does someone accept the limitation of rights or not, and how does he act as an entrepreneur if he does this? And the fourth point, agility of policy making. So I think this is simply the question: how, let's say, innovation is a process where you have continuously to adapt to new developments on the market. This is part of the idea of innovation. And I think the same should be part of the idea of state of exception, culture. To think, are the means we have decided for, are they proper means or not? Do we have to adapt them to a new situation or not? And this agility thinking, I guess, is the fourth parameter I want to research on. So far, in the short term, thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Jona. I will thank to facilitate, but I want to ask you a clarifying question about the center of this circle, the innovation parameters of exception policy. I think the idea to examine innovation and exceptionalist policies is very, very interesting, but I'm not sure what are you asking exactly. What is the effects of innovation on the state of exception, or what is the effects of the state of exception on innovation?
That's
the question.
Yes.
Because actually one can argue that it's a circle, because the innovation can affect the chances of catastrophes, and therefore innovation also affects the state of exception. So once it's a mutual effect, it's much more difficult to hypothesize and analyze.
Yes, that's true. Well, I think it's really thought and from a policy comparison perspective. So it's really to analyze and compare different political approaches with different forms of exceptional policies that we find and how they are designed in a certain situation. And the question how this influences the outcome, and the outcome is, so to say, or the output, the economic perspective. So of course you're right. In the end, it's a circular model because of course the shape of the economy and the question whether you have a innovative cluster or not will shape policy making in a certain time. So yeah, you have these rebound effects. But my personal focus in research is really on this input-output relation.
Could I ask also one clarifying question?
Sure.
Would that be okay? When you were at one of the slides, you were talking about Schumpeter's definition of innovation as a process of creative destruction. Can you say something about that? It sounds interesting, but I didn't understand it.
Yeah, of course. So the interesting point with Schumpeter is that when he talks about innovation as a disruptive process, he sees it as a starting point where a new product makes an old product or an old process to die on the market. So
really destruction.
Yeah, it's a form of destruction, but it's creative because something new makes something old disappear on the market. So to say.
What I'm missing is the origin of the exceptional policies. We started to speak about the exceptional policies and the outcomes. But what I'm concerned with is what drives exceptional policies besides pandemics. And we have the term of political economy. And this term is not in the presentation. And I mean specifically the actions of governments across Europe, Israel, for instance, now, and what is the influence of these actions on innovation, on the economy? Of course, we have the rating agencies letters, Moody's, for instance. How do you see the impact of these changes on the economy and on innovation? Israel, as you know, has the name of a startup nation. So how do you see the impact of such downgrading? I mean, it's not downgrading, actually, it's defocus, but it has an impact on the economy.
Well, first of all, I think that with Israel, one of the interesting questions is if you regard the complexity of circumstances this country has to handle, why is it possible to build up a startup nation, if we use this term, under such high complexity of variables? And on the other hand, if you compare it to other states who have much easier environment, so to say, why don't they have the possibility to build up an innovative culture? And one, of course, of the crucial points is, if you regard this from the institutional economic perspective, is to say you have a good working institutions. So the quality of institutions is regarded as a criteria for the economic output that you can generate, and also for the question: do you have an innovative economy or not? What you ask secondarily, of course, I think that the motive behind exceptional policies are very different. And with my research, my interest is to really focus on more on the question: what is the output, and what motivates policymakers to use this as a tool? Because it's, of course, a tool with very strict rules that you have to obtain in order to use it. So it's not that easy to say, okay, let's make a state of exception because let's say the companies require some new rule setting, for example. So I guess that there are some burdens that you have to fulfill in order to use it as policy making. And I guess this is also a security perspective, of course, that is implemented in most of the constitutions. And my personal perspective focuses on the results of the use and less on the question, does the use or does the interest of market participants influence the question if a use gets more likely or more interesting for policy? But I don't know whether I got everything of your remarks. So if it's not perfect, try to ask me from a different perspective.
Personally, I think that innovation is only one aspect, very important one aspect. Policy makers should consider macroeconomics influences and microeconomics influences. Innovation, as entrepreneur view, impacts both the macroeconomics and the microeconomics. But the idea behind this innovation is actually, I think, culture, narratives, risk-taking. And we, the Israelis, we are very, very engaged in all of these aspects. And what bothers me today, looking at the letter of Moody's, the recent letter, is how these policy changes, would affect the economy. And as I'm familiar very much with rating agencies from my back profession, I know that whenever they are considering rating, they take into consideration various parameters that there are some instances where one outweighs the other. As an example, in 2016, Poland was downgraded because of the constitutional changes, legal reform, and so on. In 2018, 2 years after, they upgraded Poland to the formal ratings. It was A- in 2016. It was downgraded to BBB+, and then it was in 2018 upgraded. Nothing happened with the regime. Maybe on the contrary. But in the balancing of the rating agencies, they considered that the situation is proper for upgrading the rating. But in the in-between and 6 years after 2018, still nothing happened in Poland from the rating perspective. The GDP growth continued. And of course, there is a theoretical question. What would have the question of what if it wasn't downgraded in 2016, what would have happened in the future? And I am very concerned today with Israel and with the economy of Israel in this sector of innovation, startups and so forth. And I thought maybe you have some ideas. How do you see the future for such a trend, for such a way where the government took very urgent steps with what we call the legal reform?
Well, what you're reading,
or the regime destruction, whatever, as it can,
Yeah, of course. What ratings agencies, of course, do is regarding the stability or the believed stability of a political system, and I guess that this is part of the important aspect with regard to Israel. So that as long as this insecurity or instability is a part of the of daily business, we simply have the situation that this insecurity is regarded as a negative aspect for investments for innovative activity, because these are all economic actions that take their time, and investments that need their time. And innovation is not something that you start and the next day you have payback time. It's really a process. And I guess as long as insecurity is high, the rating is low, and has an impact because it makes investments, which are always long-term thinking, to something very risky. So it increases the risks that are part of every decision, whether you invest in an innovative concept or not.
Everything becomes unsecure.
But I'm totally with you. So it's a narrative, it's a story that you tell, and of course the story gets influenced by arguments that you find in triple ratings, and which have a very, very strong influence. We have seen this in the financial crisis and the effects on the euro states, the weak euro states in the south. So this showed the potential of these ratings, and I guess this is something that will endure as long as insecurity endures.
You know that the 2008 subprime crisis was a very good example for how the rating agencies can do mistakes. And it was a mistake by the rating agencies, because because in the market and financial markets there were, I would say, toxic bonds that were very high rated, despite the fact that this rating was unrealistic. And of course, they have rectified the rating process and so on. But still, there is an impact of this rating agencies on what I call the sentiment of the investors. They want to be sure that nobody will change the rules after they have invested. And this is I think, the main point. This is the main point.
Yes, you're right.
I have a clarification question.
Yeah,
about the comparison you did between 2003, 2009, and 2021, yes. Right? So if you can just, I wasn't clear about how innovation plays into these different moments in time. And also if there are any differences if you talk about like an economic crisis, or in the case of COVID, like a health crisis, or if you think about other natural disasters or issues. Yeah.
Well, first of all, it was the question how the indicators on, for example, startup activity or early entrepreneurial activity, as they are called, change in the time after a certain crisis. And what I looked on were economic crises that had a severe impact or a significant impact on the GDP, so on the economic growth. And what you can see is that the pandemic differs from other forms of economic crisis, and had a more severe impact on these innovative culture, if I'm allowed to say it that way. And of course, you could now ask yourself, is this something that always happens with a health crisis? I can't answer it, which is, you have to compare to other health crises, and I don't think we have innovative indicators with I don't know, the influenza.
But it's quite counterintuitive, right? It was also for you. I mean, you would think that in an economic crisis you'd have less because
yes.
Okay.
So the idea, what really made me mention this is the fact that you think that innovation is really coupled to the economic development, and the question, does a new economic sector like digitalization, as I said in the dot-com crisis, does it push the market? And if it gets a damper, you would expect a high impact on the innovation indicator. But this did not appear in such a manner like it did in the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So, and this is why I think that there are cultural topics that play into this role, that it influences people's risk-taking actions. And this is something that we can see later in innovation indicators.
we have no questions from the audience, but I have a little question.
Yes.
You're talking about policy, and Harry was mentioning the companies that are private. Whose policy? I mean, maybe if you're talking about governmental policies is one thing, but there are many other actors around that can influence the whole thing, also the narrative and etc. So did you consider the policies of other actors, other the government?
Well, as I tried to explain, I set my focus in order to make it not too complex on the policy that in the end is used for solving a situation. Of course, you can ask yourself, how does this policy appear? It gets discussed. There are several influencing factors. You also have lobbyism, as you mentioned, especially when we are talking about compensation policy, who gets money for, and these are questions, of course, where different actors play a role that I do not concern to make it more easy. So that I really try to develop a model that shows the effects of the policies. And if I try to include the whole process, how they are created, it might simply get too complex. But from the realistic perspective, of course, you're right that we cannot regard exception policies just as the result of a governmental decision. It's of course, there are other factors that play into the game, and especially when we're talking, as I said, about fiscal spending, so who gets how much money to compensate the situation, then we are deeply in lobbyism, and then we're deeply in the influencing zone. And if you regard the pandemic compensation in Germany, that's what I researched on also, you can really see this influence of lobbyism and big industry players. And this is also something with regard to the risk culture that you can shape and ask, where you can ask critically, is this a fair compensation of a risk? Because self-employed artists had a totally different risk compensation to someone with a secure job in industry who is employed. So they're really different weightings, and they come from lobbyism. So that's part of the shaping process of the policy making. But of course, it's too complex for my model actually to integrate.
Okay, we don't have any questions. So I think we will thank you very, very much. It was fascinating. And we look forward to see the results.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.